Okay, so it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Steve Rowe, who's President and Chief Executive Officer of Newtrient. And he's had a diverse background in agriculture, especially in the dairy sector. And he's going to tell us today about a really interesting and exciting company that he's in charge of that is doing exciting things in resource recovery in the dairy sector. So let's welcome Steve Rowe.
Morning. Everyone had your coffee? So I'm Steve Rowe. I am lucky enough to be part of a company that is deep in the agricultural sector, and my background is actually a little mixed. It's both in the non-point source world and the point source world. I spent nearly 10 years in a heavy manufacturing setting. And my background, real quickly, is a natural resources degree from the University of Michigan, and then a law degree, and I went on and did mostly environmental work in one setting or another. So I want to start out with a story of the way I look at this, and I ask the rest of you to look at this today, especially today. This is a tremendous group. I went through the list of who's here. Very, very impressive. Very impressive. And first off, how many farmers are in the room? Right on. Okay. Actually, more than we usually get, right? So we're going to talk about this. But I'm a skier. I grew up in Michigan, and you can guess maybe where I went to law school. Went to the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and those skiers, right? Little chuckles. People know, yeah, of why I went there. I got into 7 schools and chose that one because it's really a skiing mecca. Okay, and I thought 3 years of school and skiing would be enough. Stayed there 10 years. Okay, so part of the reason was because what happens is storms come in off the west coast, they hit the Sierras, those clouds get thrown much higher into the air, and then they travel about 700 miles across the basin and range. And those crystals just all the moisture comes out. And then the first big mountain range they hit is the Wasatch. And that's where you get this champagne powder. And they just unload on the Wasatch in the right years. And so this was in the, between about 82 and 85. And for those who know, those were epic years like this year was in Tahoe. Those years were in the Wasatch Range. So to make matters more difficult to finish law school, I also taught skiing at Snowbird. And one of the best ski schools in the country. We had, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 people on the national demonstration team. It was great. It was a good time. People would come to Snowbird to learn how to ski the powder. And they would be great skiers. And we would take them out, and very quickly, about 10 o'clock, all my friends had skied off the face of the runs, and so you'd have to go into the trees, right? And that's where you found this great powder. And what we found as instructors was a very predictable pattern. Great skiers, particularly from the Midwest and the East, who could ski anything. I mean, those who ski know the blue ice that is in the Northeast. Well, there's no such thing out there. It's this beautiful snow. But they'd go into the trees, and we'd find these great skiers would all of a sudden become clumsy. And they couldn't do what they could do 10 feet over on the open hill. So we would talk about this in the locker room. We'd talk, what are the techniques we want to use to get people to really enjoy this experience, right? And so I then met a woman who eventually became my wife, and she grew up in Salt Lake City and actually misspent most of her wonderful youth at Alta, which was the resort just up the hill, which is a little more even legendary than Snowbird. And she is a great skier. Because she's not here, I will say that she's probably better than I am. And we would go skiing, and she grew up there, and we went into the trees one day, and we were kind of courting each other. And all of a sudden, this great skier, is clumsy, is kind of ungainly, and things aren't working. And I stopped, and I said, "What's the problem, Lynn?" Like an idiot guy does. What's your problem? And I turned around. This is the truth. she had her ski pole up like this, about to hit me across the back of the head, and she said, "It's all these damn trees." So I will tell you, this is a true story, and I had a lifelong personal epiphany. Because I realized at that moment, I was not seeing the trees, I was looking at the spaces. Because that's what mattered. And that's why skiing in the trees didn't bother me. Because I didn't see the trees. What mattered was going through the spaces. And that's the challenge I make to this group. We have a tendency when we're trying to solve a sustainability issue, which by its nature is complicated because there are three big sets of tremendous variables, social, economic, and environmental, that we tend to shoot things down. Oh, this won't work because of this. That's a tree. That won't work because of that. It's a tree. And we're missing the point. The point is the spaces. And when a group like this gets together, we've got to focus on the spaces and see, how do we get there? What does it mean? Don't focus on the trees. So that's what I would ask as you think about this today and we interact with each other in the future on this issue. So I can tell you a little bit about the company. So this is a little outdated, and I apologize, but I really like this guy. This is the now former Secretary of USDA, Secretary Vilsack. And he now actually has moved into the dairy industry now that he's lost his job. And he's really a wonderful gentleman. And because there's only a couple of farmers here, I love this clip to give you a little sense of his view after running USDA for a lot of years, at least 8 years. His view, I just think it's very impressive. Let's see if we can get this to work.
It breaks my heart that we have this conflict within agriculture, that there are various ways of growing things and raising things, and that for whatever reason we don't speak with a single voice about the greatness of American agriculture. And people say, well, do you favor organic? Do you favor GMOs? Do you favor this? And I say, look, it's like asking me which of my two sons I love the most. I love them both. Here's what agriculture does, and I'll finish with this. Every one of us that's not a farmer is not a farmer because we have farmers. We've delegated the responsibility of feeding our families to a relatively small percentage of this country. If you look at 85% of what's grown in this country, it's raised by 200,000 to 300,000 people. That's less than 1/10 of 1% of America. But the other 99% of us can be lawyers and doctors and Peace Corps volunteers and economists and people that work for government and all of the other occupations. Because we never think about, well, geez, do I have to actually grow the food for my family? No, I go to the grocery store and get it. So I'm free to do whatever I want to do with my life. That is an incredible freedom that we take for granted in this country. It is not true in most of the countries in this world. And then when we go to the grocery store, we walk out of it with more money in our pocket as a percentage of our paychecks than anybody else in the world. So we have this incredible economy that's consumer-oriented that allows us to buy stuff. It's unbelievable. And rather than being criticized and criticized and demonized at times, we ought to be celebrating these people, in my view. And we don't do it enough of it. So, thanks for the question.
Well, thank you.
I just really think that that's an important message that we forget. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this company, Newtrient, but it's important you understand this is not any sort of sales pitch for the company. And in fact, what we're doing may be things that may be of benefit and opportunity for you. We're a very different kind of company. We are, in some ways, you might think of us as a foundation with a purpose. And it started, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago. The leading dairy cooperatives got together and they said, hey, digesters make a lot of sense. They pencil out, good story, helps with a lot of issues on the farm. So how do we go from what was then maybe 60 or 70 in the country to 1,500 very quickly? And how do we drive a business to do that? So, as is often the case in a lot of industries, including agriculture, we talked about it so long that the opportunity went away. So it costs what, 9 cents to run a digester on a dairy farm. Anybody know what you can get for energy these days? 9 cents a kilowatt hour, that's about the cost. Today, for a contract, maybe 2.5 cents. So all this discussion about digesters, and actually a lot of the discussion going on in California still about digesters, is misplaced because on the sustainability leg of economics, it doesn't work. And you can only be so green for so long running in the red. Okay? So, got to keep that in mind. So, but to their credit, these leaders stayed together. And there were about 5 or 6 co-ops. I was general counsel for one of them at the time and very engaged in this conversation. We decided to stay together to see if we could work on the environmental issues that were happening. The list of cases, litigation that Jim had thrown up there before, if you haven't read about it or heard about it, you should know about a case called Cow Palace. And this was a case in the central portion of the state of Washington. And it was the first case that a citizen suit had been filed. And though it didn't get to a published opinion, there's a very interesting 110-page opinion about why manure can be regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is the solid and hazardous waste statute. And what they said for the first time, and it completely blew the minds of farmers, that if you over-apply or misapply manure, it can be a solid waste, and if it's a solid waste, it has the chance of becoming a hazardous waste. So that changed everybody's outlook as to what's going on. So we decided to stay together and to talk about this issue, and we realized there are things that we can do on the farm that have environmental value, that we can really help society with these issues. And so that's really how this group came together. And what we did is we brought not just the 5 or 6 of us, we went out to the dairy community and we brought in about 12 co-ops, and they provide the funding for this organization to do what it needs to do. That's why I say, look, we're entrepreneurial, I'll talk about that, we're going to make money, but that's not really the core purpose here. This is really to solve these societal issues and regain some of the consumer trust that people had in farmers that is waning. You know, for decades, farmers were considered the most trustworthy voices. Now that's really on shaky legs. So I know you don't know these folks, but they represent, if you exclude the bottom 2, they represent half the milk in the country and about 22,000 farms. And this is my board of directors. When you add in the bottom 2, it's the other half. So those of you who know what a checkoff organization is, DMI is the checkoff organization, so they represent all milk producers in the country. And then the image of the capital was the trade association for the organization. We up, Philip? Okay, great. So, give you a little framework, and I apologize for every point I'm making. For some of you, you know this very well. But there's a why. Why are we doing this? And the grand why, for me, the grand why, are these two folks. One is Malthus. Remember, Malthus was the one who said population is exponential and resources are not. Now, we keep getting better at resources, better use, a little more recycling, a little more reduce, reuse, recycle, that whole conversation. But at some point, there's a point of crisis. And we're having the conversation about the point of crisis a lot more now than we did when I learned this in the late 70s. And the other piece is, hey, Philip, we keep losing our picture. But the bottom is Maslow's hierarchy. And Maslow's hierarchy is a psychologist. Maslow was a psychologist. He was all about teaching self-awareness and what do you need to begin with. And what you need is the bottom layer of his hierarchy, which is physiological. Protection, food, warmth, the basics. So that's food, and Malthus is resources, and we need clean water and food. So for me, this becomes what I call an and issue, not an or issue. This isn't a luxury item. This is food and clean water. So starting with that, we got to find the spaces, right? Is this working enough?
I'm trying to get an option.
Okay.
Alternative option. Keep going.
Yep, I'll keep rolling. So, and I'm going to leave the slides with Jim, so don't worry about all the words, especially with the eye test that's happening. I just want to tell you that Newtrient is it's an entrepreneurial company driven by the leaders in the dairy industry. And see, this is why I do this. So this is going to age me, and some of you will laugh. I used to do talk, well, I've always done a lot of talks, but I used to walk around with cellophanes, right? With an overhead, just in case this newfangled thing called PowerPoint didn't work. So, who's progressed, right? I can look around the room and tell your ages by who's chuckling and who's wondering, what is this? What's an overhead, right? Next one I'm going to come is a film loop, right? Film strips. So, all right, we're an entrepreneurial organization. Our focus really is to reduce the environmental footprint of dairy and make it economically viable to do so. That's the trick. That's the space we're trying to get to, okay? There are three components of our organization. One, I'm going to show you a video, try to show you a video, of a catalog we developed. And I encourage all of you to go there. It's an open source data, and what we did, believe it or not, I'm always amazed at the world we work in, right? You know, so my career has clearly gone to crap. So we have looked at, I have this amazing team. Take a look on the website. It would take too long to go through everybody, but you'll recognize somebody on there, and if not, you'll be intimidated by their skill set. Not by mine, but by theirs. And we looked at, believe it or not, every manure management technology in North America that was in place or nearly in place or had tried to enter the market. And at that time, before we started, the common thought was, well, there's centrifuges was about as cutting edge as you could think of, and then there were some presses and digesters. Well, we accumulated about 250 different vendors and or technologies. And some of them we just threw out because they're not in the space anymore, and some of them we dug in. And now about 180 of them are in this catalog, which is available to you. Just go to our website, take a look. It's all there for you. It's here for you, okay? I want to stimulate your thoughts on this. And what we did is we did sort of a Consumer Reports view on it. We give information about the company, we give information about the technology, how it works, why it works, and then we have asked for a tremendous amount of information from the company. And then we looked at all that information and we scored it. There's a 9-point scoring system, and you'll see, I think it's fascinating. And we tried to keep it as objective as possible. And then we have a section there that is our opinion about the technology or the vendor. So you might say this technology is great, but the vendor is underfunded. And so they're having a hard time fulfilling their long-term obligations to the technology. That sort of thing you'll find there. We then have a few that if, for whatever reason, we have a very subjective piece. It's the editor's pick, where there are a few where we've said you've deserved some special recognition. Either you've been in the space a long time and had a lot of success, or you're new and we as a group of experts are very intrigued by what you're doing. So how are we doing there, Philip? So I'm going to keep plowing through, and I can talk to you. So that's one leg of the organization, is this catalog. And that's for everybody. And part of it is to stimulate your thoughts, what's out there, what could be made better, because most of the vendors in this space, not all, but most are what I call garage bands. They are usually someone who grew up on or near a farm. They are somebody with a little bit of money and they want to make more money, and then a nutty professor, right? Okay, somebody who says, I know how to do the chemistry of that, or I know the physics of that. And so we can separate phosphorus, or we can capture the nitrogen, we can sequester the ammonia. And so they create a company. You good? Okay. Okay. Yeah, you're, okay. All right. Philip, do you think you can start that? Excellent. This is something we did for the dairy annual meeting. About 3,000 dairy families watched this year. So you got to click that, and then an arrow will appear if it doesn't load. Magically. All right, so I'm going to keep talking while they're trying to figure that out. So the second leg of our organization is as an incubator. Okay, no worries. I'll just keep going. Can I control it here, or do I want you to? Okay, all right. So this is our website. Go take a look. The video would tell you about our scoring system, but it's all on the website. So you'll see it. But I really encourage you and ask you to look, and if you have thoughts or suggestions for us, we're an open source organization. Call us, talk to us, tell us what we're missing, tell us what you know that we don't. So the second is the products and the technology. So very often what happens is these technology companies will come to us and say, how do we get into the dairy industry? How do we make a lot of money? And we will work with them to advance them. We want them to get better. And we want to accelerate their ability to provide benefits to the organization, to the industry. The other piece is products. And this is a fascinating slide, the way it came about. I asked my team one day, very early on, so what can we make from manure? And in about 15 minutes, so this wasn't a long exercise, this is the list they came up with. And if you think about it, farmers pay a lot for manure. They do everything that they have done to create milk or meat is the same thing they've done to create the manure. And they've figured out how to capture the value of the milk and meat, but they've not figured out how to capture the value of the manure. And we know there's stuff in the manure that people pay for. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we ski that space, right? How do we ski that space? So it's a fascinating list, and the funny part is down at the bottom, it doesn't show it here, but the bottom one on the manure-based products is humus. And I always have to tell the audience, it's not hummus, it's not chickpeas, so it's humus. So this list is long, and actually you lose some down at the bottom, so I'm glad I'll be able to leave the slides with Jim and make them available to all of you. But you can see there's an energy component, there's things we can literally make from manure. Actually, there's this product out of Italy called Mercata. Think about that, Mercata, which is terracotta products, furniture, all sorts of things that you might make from terracotta, which is clay, using manure. And they call it Mercata. So think about the French on that. I think that's pretty funny. So, all right. And then the last piece here, and so we're developing products and we're developing the technologies so that we can generate capital so that the farmers can make money off their manure. Now, those of you, I know you don't know the dairy industry, but whey has been a problem in the dairy industry as a waste product for decades. It was the byproduct of the cheese plants. Now, there are many cheese plants that are surviving on the global price for whey, and they're really making the whey, and the cheese is the byproduct. That's what needs to happen on the manure. That's where we need to get to. So, okay. So the last piece I want to talk about now, how are we doing on time, Jim? Okay. So I want to talk about the fact that you all know this. This is such an interesting group to talk to because usually your strengths are often the weaknesses of the industry or the audience I talk to. You know these cycles. This is your home. This is where most of you spend your lives, your professional lives. And you know that these cycles, these natural cycles, impact farmers and our food production, and the farmers impact these cycles. And so just that recognition is you would be, and maybe you aren't amazed, but I was amazed how few people understand that, okay? And how many times, this is the slide that a lot of folks in the food or farming world will say, hold on a second, talk to me about how I fit into this. because they've not thought of themselves in this systems thinking analysis around this. This is where you all live, and so it's very important that you keep talking about it, that one change affects another. And that's why looking for the spaces, the positive results, is so important. Because otherwise we're going to get stuck here for another 2 decades talking about the trees. We know there are a lot of trees. Need this group in particular to be thinking about the spaces. So now I'm going to take you back into my world, environmental lawyer. Back in the 70s, all of the major environmental statutes were being approved, and interestingly enough, under a Republican administration. Anyone know who signed EPA into existence? Nixon. Who signed most of the major environmental statutes? Nixon. So it's interesting where the spaces can appear, okay? And so in the 70s, what we were dealing with were billowing smokestacks and nasty outflows from pipes. There was really no environmental regulation in the country. And so the conversation was, how do we deal with that? What do we do? And so we passed these statutes, we passed the existence of an enforcement agency at the federal level. They started to proliferate at the state levels. And what we said was, what about all this land in between our cities? And what we did is we punted. First off, agriculture wasn't involved. You remember a statute is this thick, the rules are this thick, and then the enforcement guidance and procedures are, boxes lining the rim, right, in terms of volume. So, but agriculture wasn't really involved. They are what is a non-point source. Traditional manufacturing is a point source. It's a smokestack or it's a pipe. And it has become relatively easy to regulate. I can take a sample, I can send it to a lab, and I know, am I in compliance with my permit or am I not? So I spent 10 years in the cement industry. Talk about a point source, serious point source, right? And I used my permits as a competitive weapon. Those of you, I was in the car with Mark today, and he's from Toledo, and just north of Toledo, between Toledo and Ann Arbor, is the U.S. headquarters of a company called Holcim, the largest cement company in the world, and the cement plant was there. And I actually managed the cement plant. I still can't believe that I did it. And we would do things like, oh, okay, you want us to be more open about our stack emissions. So I, through the phone lines, set up a monitor, we're now talking old monitors, with an orange line giving exactly what my stack emissions were, and I set it up in the waiting room of the Department of Natural Resources in Michigan. Because no one believed us. And I'm a huge believer in transparency. I'm okay with problems. I'm just going to be transparent about it and tell people this is hard to accomplish. But I put our smokestack monitor in that office. Man, did we get tremendous kudos, because it is the most boring thing you can imagine. It is basically a line with very little tiny blips 24 hours a day. And eventually they called and asked me to remove it, which was a huge victory for us, because we proved to them that this permit worked and that we were in compliance. And I heard a giggle from a friend from EPA just now. So, but whatever they put on our permit, our goal was to make sure that our competitors had the same challenge. And then I could compete the heck out of it. Okay? So there's a difference, though. In the non-point source world, that's where it isn't pipes or smokestacks. How do you measure the emissions from 1,000 acres of land or 10,000 acres of land? And we've been trying over the last few years to try and measure them and model them in a way that feels like a smokestack or feels like a pipe. I'm telling you, it's only going to get harder, because now we're having 2 10-year storms in a 6-month interval. The models can't absorb that kind of information. And so we're best guesses at best. And that's why we punted. We punted in the 70s on the non-point sources, and we said, well, let's let the states figure it out. That was one punt. And we said, we'll figure it out later. Well, 2 things have happened. Later is now, and the states are overwhelmed. They don't have the kind of resources. And so the way this works in the Clean Water Act essentially is the federal government says to the state, you figure out how to get into compliance with the limits we put on your neighboring federal waters, and if you don't, we'll come in and do it for you. And that's a hassle for everybody. I got to tell you, even the feds, no one wants that to happen. But it's this very long, laborious process with very expensive. So that's where we ended up. And so the goal is, let me add one piece. On point sources, traditional manufacturing, they are to a degree price makers of their products. When the auto manufacturers eventually relented and said, okay, we'll put on catalytic converters, two things happened. One, every new car manufacturer in the US had to put on a catalytic converter. So playing field stayed even. Awesome. Secondly, what happened? Cars went up in price about $100. So to a degree, they're price makers. In the food world, and this is an important piece to remember here, agriculture for the most part are price takers. I can be the absolute worst dairy environmentally on the road, and my neighbor can be the most advanced, forward-thinking, highly tech dairy on the road, and we get paid the same amount for our milk. And actually, if my butterfat's a little higher, I may even get paid more. I can't adjust that price from the farm level. That is a very important economic concept as we try and find the spaces in this discussion. Farmers, food production is primarily price takers. Okay? So we've got to find some other way for them to absorb this added cost into the food production system. Otherwise, they'll run in the red, and those dairies will disappear, farms will disappear, and we've got a whole new different kind of food structure. It's less secure, less diverse, less culturally the way we want it to be. And so, real quickly, this is Garrett Hardin. He wrote an article called Tragedy of the Commons, and it was his model that said, look, these natural resources are shared amongst all of us, but all of us have individual personal desires to improve economically. And so as a result, we will destroy these resources inadvertently because we're serving our personal needs. It's a fascinating little article written in the late 60s, and it was really the basis for why EPA and these regulatory agencies were formed, which his theory was you needed an outside entity to control the commons, the resources. So we've been doing this for now, 30, 40 years, and they're negative drivers: regulation, permit, litigation, and citizen enforcement. Most of the cases you see, this cow palace I talk about, it's citizen enforcement, not agency enforcement. So there's a little bit of a wild card there as well. So where we've got to move to is positive drivers. And these are just some examples. Value the environmental asset services that somebody can do, especially if they can do it cheaper than someone else. I'm a big believer that the lowest cost pollution prevention should go first, and it should get paid for by the highest cost pollution prevention obligations. Okay? So I'm going to blast through here. We lost a little time, but I'm going to get through this. So, and we're really worried. We're trying to treat non-point sources with perfection. It can't happen. It can't happen. They're non-point sources for a reason, because we couldn't measure them then, and we still have a difficult time now. So we need to be directionally correct and not so worry about the perfection. You all know this way better than I do, but this is the production process for phosphorus. You've seen this. And so all I want to point out here is, so you go through this long process, there's this exchange of materials and money all the way through, and then it gets to the cows. How much phosphorus does a cow make? Anybody know? Yes. They don't make any phosphorus. But what are we doing? We're regulating phosphorus between the cow's rear end and the local river. The cow doesn't make phosphorus, but that's where it comes together just before it hits the commons, the water. And so we're trying to regulate it there. There's an inherent unfairness in this supply chain. Something's wrong here. We need to share the costs or opportunities of recycling that phosphorus and reusing it. So part of this is I want to get everyone involved in this supply chain involved in this finding the space. So I'm getting close, Jim. All right, so here's our theory. So there are water quality trading programs all over the country, about, 25 or 30 of them, and none of them have flourished. And the idea is just built on this concept, where someone upstream can reduce the pollution load less expensively than someone downstream. And so all these pilots have said, okay, farmer, You go find the industrialist, the wastewater treatment plant or the paper mill, and you go cut a deal. And EPA, all along, several decades now, has supported this concept. But it doesn't work, or it hasn't flourished. Here are all the pilots around the country. A couple of reasons why it hasn't worked. One, where the farmers live and where the industrial urban community live are not just 60 miles away. They are different planets. Okay? If you spend some time thinking about that, you'll understand what happened and why this administration that's in now is so different and how they won. The urbanites, we have ignored food production in the rural communities for a long time, but yet we're very comfortable telling them the way we want them to grow our food. And now we're even a little stuck in some punishment around pollution when they're saying, when the farmers are saying, hey, wait a second, I've been feeding you for 5 generations, and now you're saying the way I've been doing it is wrong? So there's a cultural disconnect here. Secondly, all these pilots, what do you notice about them? They're very small. And how do you create markets? You got to make them big and robust. So we've got to rethink what we think about watersheds. Okay? If you just build an economic model around a single navigable waterway, which is what most of these are built on, there's not enough robust economy. What was the most successful trading program this country's ever seen? Anybody? No? Elimination of acid rain and SOx, sulfur. Okay? Powerful. But it's because we used the whole country to do the trading program. Now, there are air sheds. We just ignore them. There are air sheds. So if I reduce sulfur down in southern Arizona, I'm really not going to affect the Northeast, which is where the problem was. But we allowed them to trade as well. I know that because I traded sulfur out of Michigan. So here's the model, and then I'll leave you for the discussion for the day. Okay. So we built a different model, and that is with a clearinghouse in the middle. So the clearinghouse can go to the farmers and say, all right, you use these great technologies that we have found that work, that pull out phosphorus, for example, out of your manure, and you pull it out, put it to a beneficial use, meaning where it won't become fugitive emissions. And in agriculture, generally what? 40–50% of what goes on the land eventually in some way becomes a fugitive emission. And that's how food grows, okay? So that's not going to change in any dramatic way. So I can talk to a farmer and say, you separate this, I'll verify that you're taking that phosphorus out of the waterway and putting it to a beneficial use, or even removing it from the waterway completely. You get an environmental credit. And I can tell you, a dairy farmer, can do that for less than 20 bucks. Okay? I'm going to use some numbers for scale. So let's say it costs them 100 bucks to do that. So if I pay that farmer $110 for that credit, I know farmers. They will do that all day long. Fair? Cost you 100 bucks, I'll pay you 110, you'll do that all day long. And if I can give you enough certainty, you'll go to the bank and borrow the $1 million you need for the equipment against that contract, then you're set for a decade. Once I have that verified credit, I'll go to the industrial community, wastewater treatment plants, paper mills, cement plants, and say, you're struggling to remove the next pound of phosphorus. In all these facilities that are old, and this is part of the infrastructure problem in this country, the next pound of phosphorus can cost you $1,000. I know in some communities we've seen it can cost nearly $10,000 when you add the cost of rebuilding the entire plant. So I can go to them and say, listen, I'll sell you a credit that is supported by your permit for 800 bucks. They'll do that all day long. If their head's on, and if they hear what the taxpayers are saying, especially the wastewater treatment plants, they'll do that all day long. Okay? So now I've accumulated a lot of money in this clearinghouse in the middle. And people ask me, so who would be against this? This is like a no-brainer. This is a, this is my Scooby-Doo moment for you, where I want you to go, is it really this simple? Yes, it is. So the only group that I can say really might have some concern are the folks who are living right at the foot of the paper mill, right? So the environmental justice community. And they're a legitimate voice. My view is, like the greenhouse gas program in California, you know how much money they accumulate in the middle? About $2 billion a year. Okay, that's just GHGs. So this excess money, I think those communities or hot spots of pollution should have a right to apply and apply those monies in those places. That's our model. And I will tell you, we are pushing this model. We have met with the new administrator, Pruitt, and I will tell you, I got a personal letter from him thanking me for the idea. He's assigned us senior staff to this, and this is what I believe is the future of non-point source pollution prevention. It's not enforcement, it's a market-driven mechanism to let the non-point source world, most of the land in this country, participate in an economic way to be more effective at pollution prevention. So we're deeply involved. Vermont has paid us money to help figure out what the protocol is to create a verified credit. The state of Wisconsin is about to give us a bunch of money to help figuring out the rules and the criteria around the clearinghouse and what a certified credit will be for the other side. What I like about this is its simplicity. And you no longer have to have the farmer finding the industrialist. I can talk to the farmers in their language, then I can talk to the industrialists in their language. So with that, here are the takeaways, and I would just remind you again throughout the day today, look for the spaces and kind of ignore the trees. So, thanks, Jim.
So thank you so much for that inspiring remarks. I do think you were listening in on the RCN for several years. It's really fantastic stuff. So we have time for a few moments for questions. There's a microphone, so if anyone wants to ask something, we can take time for that right now before we move on to the panel. So who would like to ask a question?
Okay, let's just do it then.
Up.
Hi, I'm Laura Jensen. I'm from Heidelberg, and I had some questions about the, some of the complications with trading phosphorus. If you guys have thought about how the delivery of a point source and a delivery of a non-point source are very different when you're trying to trade them, and what impacts that could have on a large-scale watershed, even if you get beyond just that one navigable water.
So if you think about, it's a great question, and the natural science of this it really is a giant mass balance, okay? And things like attenuation are true, but the collection and the impact are less than we think. What I'm getting at is I really believe that to engage the non-point source world in pollution prevention in a real way, we have to get on with it, because I know we're directionally correct. If we can get more of the phosphorus locally sourced from the farm and into plants and into the food, you are improving the waterway. So you have a time difference. So the waterway now, I also I fly fish, so I'm thinking, awesome. So now our waterway is cleaner from its source out to the mouth of the river. The net effect, the math on this is the same. The mass balance is the same. It's just different locations. So there's a time difference before you get the benefit down at the mouth of the river. So that's one aspect of it, is the mass balance is the same. And the other piece for me is we just have to get on with this. We have to get on with this. And I know that there's some of the folks that are deeply embedded in the traditional industrial side of the mining and production of phosphorus. We are not trying to create any winners or losers. And actually what I'm hoping for, those are the folks who I want to make the most money. I want them to create the marketplace for locally sourced and recycled phosphorus. That's the way I want them to do it. They have the deepest knowledge. So.
Okay, we have a question up here.
Yes, well, a comment and a question. I liked your reference to Mercata. So that was Sunday New York Times Magazine article.
Oh, did they do it again? Okay.
A couple of months ago, so you can just Google NewYorkTimes.com and you can find it. Very interesting.
MERCADATA.
Yes.
Mercata.
All right, so Heidelberg actually inspired this question. A couple of massive algae blooms ago in the western Lake Erie, which the Maumee River watershed dumps all that phosphorus and pollutant nutrients into, that contributes to these massive algae blooms. Heidelberg did a study and estimated that there were 480 metric tons of dissolved phosphorus annually that dump into Lake Erie. So your market-driven is really challenged by the fact that phosphate fertilizer is manufactured on the scale of 60 million metric tons a year. So it's a commodity chemical. So how can you cost-effectively remove such a tiny amount that causes such a harmful problem and compete with synthetic commercial fertilizer on an economic basis?
Great question. I don't want to compete with synthetic fertilizer. I want them to jump into our model and make money in it. That's the point. So you realize what happens to the mass balance of a state? We're asking the farmers, dairy or otherwise, row crop, whoever, you've got to control your phosphorus use. You have to comply with the 4 Rs. You have to do this. They can't, okay? They can't. You understand that? They can't and continue to feed us, okay? Not if we like the way our rural communities are built these days. So, yeah, you got a problem. Because if the newly mined and manufactured fertilizer keeps coming into the state, yes, you're absolutely undermining the mass balance. And so what I really would like is help from that industry, from that supply chain I showed you, to say, we're going to get involved in the circular economy, more local, recycling, because the phosphorus is already there. You all know, there's enough phosphorus in California to serve California. So why are we bringing more phosphorus in? Because that's what we've done for the last 100 years. That's what's got to change. And I want those companies with the greatest sophistication, the greatest chemical knowledge to participate in this. And I want them to make a boatload of money. But I've got to find some. We've got to, this room has to say this is the answer. Otherwise, you're messing up the mass balance. I can stop manure from going into the waterways. I tell them, the reason I got interest in Vermont was I showed them that if we removed every single cow from the state of Vermont, they would not meet their TMDL, their pollution load limit in Lake Champlain. Because the phosphorus is going to keep coming into the state and it'll just go into row crops, and you won't have manure as a fertilizer anymore. So you'll have the same problem. That's why they said we've got to change the way we think about this.
Great questions. We're going to have time to pick up on those themes as the day goes on, especially when we have our panel discussion and discussions about total value recovery and resources. So let's give Steve another big hand and we'll get on with the first presentation.